In a world where there is so much wealth, with modern cities and plentiful resources, how can we still have so much poverty, where so many people must live on less than $1 per day? Where entire families live in one small room in squalid, informal housing settlements, far away from skyscrapers and city centers, where they don't have the means to take care of themselves.
Hobbes' statement of the life being nasty, brutish, and short is a characterization of poverty. And there's no reason for us to take any different view than that. It's a question of understanding what it means in today's context, given the fact that there are means of enhancing wealth, means of curing illnesses and postponing death, means of making our lives comfortable. Given all that, if people still suffer from deprivation, well then in the present context we have to regard that as poverty.
Meu marido está desempregado faz 5 anos e é isso, ele vende água mineral R$1, né? Pra gente sobreviver e a gente...
Eu trabalhava fazendo entrega de gás. Eu trabalhava lá em Suape, mas como agora a venda de gás aumentou e os pessoal, a população diminuiu, pronto, aí foram cortando e eu tô aqui vivendo como pode.
Antes a gente não morava aqui não, a gente morava na beira da praia. Mas aconteceu um acidente familiar, minha menina faleceu com 9 meses, aí a gente teve que ir pra rua pedir dinheiro para fazer o enterro dela. Aí do tempo que ele ficou desempregado, a vida da gente foi muito dura, de um jeito ou de outro. A gente procurou trazer o pão para dentro de casa, porque quem tem criança, né, tem que batalhar de um jeito ou de outro. Criança quando tá com fome não quer saber de onde vem, né, quer saber que quer comer.
24,000 people die every single day from hunger and hunger-related diseases, at least 24,000. And that doesn't need to happen. We have plenty of resources, so that shouldn't happen. It happens because of the system we've created. We can say without a doubt that this system is an absolute failure. From the most rational, objective, economic standpoint, it's a failure. Less than 5% of the world's population live in the United States. We are consuming over 25% of the world's resources and creating roughly 30% of its major pollution. That's a failure.
Where do we have to look to understand how it all started? Where some started to become rich and others poor.
Je pense qu'il y a une date qui est tout à fait clé, c'est 1492, quand, à partir de cette année-là, les Européens interviennent d'une manière tout à fait brutale dans l'histoire des peuples de ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui les Amériques. À partir de ce moment-là, on peut parler d'une globalisation, d'une mondialisation, parce que à peu près l'ensemble des continents de la planète au cours du XVIe siècle sont connectés les uns aux autres et de manière brutale avec une domination européenne qui va progressivement s'étendre ensuite vers l'Asie et vers l'Afrique.
El proceso de construcción de este sistema mundo colonial moderno tiene ya más de 500 años. El sistema capitalista y la era de la modernidad comenzó con el momento en el cual se da la conquista, la colonización, el sometimiento de los pueblos de América por parte de los ibéricos. Y en ese momento comienza un proceso muy sistemático y muy continuado que tiene más de 500 años de expoliación de recursos, que es simultáneamente la colonización de seres humanos y la colonización de la naturaleza.
The men who would be known as the conquistadors and the colonizers came from Spain and Portugal, and later from the United Kingdom and Holland. They stole all the riches of the Incas and the Mayas, all the gold and silver, religious artifacts, and jewels, and then started to confiscate the land, which destroyed the natural economy of the people. Such a practice had long started before in Europe, where the upper classes seized communal land from the poor families, thus depriving them of their livelihood.
When the British came towards the end of the 19th century, their concern was to justify expropriation of land which did not belong to them. And the way they did it was to use their own legal system. They did this precisely through an advice that was given to the colonial government on the 13th of December 1897 that said that in countries where there is no settled form of government, the land belongs to the Queen of England. Having declared that there was no settled form of government, they appropriated ultimate title to the land. They passed laws that said so, and then they were able to give settlers freehold interest, 999-year leases, and other forms of leasehold.
Unas cuantas familias tienen como una gran cantidad de tierras que ni siquiera las producen. Y en desmedro de quién, de los indígenas, de los originarios de estas tierras, que no pueden acceder a esta tierra. ¿Por qué? Porque la ley INRA decía que por cada cabeza de ganado se le otorgaba entre 5 y 50 hectáreas. Es decir, por una cabeza de ganado le pueden justificar 50 hectáreas de tierra. Entonces, son tierras que ni siquiera se producen, son tierras de engorde que le dicen aquí, que lo único que hacen es hacer que estas personas puedan enriquecerse más a costa de estas tierras, sin producirlas. Entonces, estamos viendo ese tema, se está trabajando mucho, y son los latifundios, grandes latifundios que vienen desde la época de la colonia, ¿no? Que se ha ido reproduciendo este sistema.
Land was confiscated and appropriated by the conquistadors and the colonizers throughout South America, Asia, and Africa, either by force or by imposing taxes on heads and huts that the people couldn't pay. Today, more than 500 years later, and dozens of years after the independence of their countries, people still don't have their lands back, which are still in the hands of large landowners and transnational corporations.
Yoga ngajor masa ni negra pakal tungana ko bullo retankishu apage do to lo papa ta yok ni togi ako ore dua pa yok masa na tungana ka lemme yolo ni jayto kilen kirta ko ngishu yolo on tare do ngishu do na narama tar ngishu ore apage do ta doko ya ko na rishata na kata nikiti no rapake yo ora pa kabele to mapeti yo la shimpana na ko ba na manya yo ora pa na kata neponu masani da inir masai tekino pop betu mi apa tun na to yapana jo paratira ne da ini apa tekino pop neponu ni na rarir masai po kono me khoma abu anya kake no magade soda ite empa korpolo setine ora ke na kata pe shari enkitoria oloibor neti apa kala pata satin kishu na pale Kenya na ore dia ba be ponu nero kuni olo de tio la ko olo pro el jamba yo lo bungeta biblia to ligi ndaiga abo bia dai teme nda kuno na ingili wana ngene de hingo jana ngene jana amo na teme nda kuno na ingili
By becoming a British colony, you actually became a property, both the country and the people. And if you look at history, they were not, the natives were not recognized as human beings. So all of you are total property of the empire. In the particular district I come from, the natives refused to work in those plantations. And if they come to work, they come in their own terms. Sometimes they won't come. So, and that's why we introduced the labor laws through the Kipande system. Kipande system is a system of registration, where every male, the moment you turn 16, you have to have a labor record. And that's the one that is used for ensuring that all male labor has got to work. And that's why the colonial labor laws really were slave laws.
Realmente en el siglo XXI vemos que todavía hay familias cautivas. Nosotros les decimos cautivas o empatronadas, pero son esclavas. Esa es la forma de decirlas. Son esclavas porque no reciben una remuneración por su trabajo. Son deudas que se transmiten de generación en generación. Las personas no pueden salir de la hacienda porque tienen una deuda con el patrón. Y no solamente es la persona, sino es su grupo familiar. Los niños trabajan, no van a la escuela porque deben trabajar. ¿A cambio de qué? De nada, solamente de la alimentación.
Having had their natural economy destroyed, forced the people to work for their new masters. It is estimated that today 60 to 80 million people still live in slave-like conditions all over the world. They work sometimes with their families in rural areas, on plantations, and in mines, as well as in cities, in exchange for food and shelter.
São Paulo is the largest state that produces ethanol in Brazil, and at the same time is the richest state. And just to give you an example, last year 17 workers died in the space where they work. They die of exhaustion. Another 419 workers have died in consequence of their work. In addition to several cases of slave labor in the sugarcane workers that the Ministry of Labor has been registered.
A visão que os empresários têm do trabalhador é ainda a visão de escravo. Eles não se desvencilharam. Hoje eles têm uma vida, uma acumulação muito mais fácil do que quando era o período do trabalho escravo, né? Porque o escravo, digamos, o patrão era dono do escravo, então ele tem que cuidar do escravo, ele tem que cuidar da saúde do escravo, ele tem que cuidar da alimentação do escravo, ele tem que cuidar da moradia, mesmo na senzala, mas ele tinha que cuidar. Hoje o patrão não tem nenhuma preocupação com essa, ele encosta o caminhão, né, na periferia da cidade, o caminhão enche, devolve, ele não tem nenhuma preocupação mais. Terminou o período da corta de cana, o trabalhador que vive lá na periferia vai buscar outras formas, vender picolé, vender pipoca, né, os filhos vão para a prostituição, né, vão para a droga, buscar outra alternativa dentro do mundo da criminalidade.
Chegamos aqui, a gente mesmo com uma boa promessa para aqui, né? Que ia ter aqui tudo em dia, garrafa, bota, tudo em ordem. Quando a gente chegamos aqui, não encontramos. Entendeu? Para se levantar aqui de 1 hora da madrugada. O fogo não é bom mesmo, porque é 4 bocas de fogo para cozinhar para bem 80 pessoas. Tem que se levantar de 1 hora da madrugada para fazer o café, porque senão a gente tem que tomar café.
E a água que a gente toma banho lá só tem ferrugem. A gente toma banho hoje, no outro dia a gente já está doente.
E a gente para receber o material, vamos recebendo de pouco a pouco. um chapéu, depois veio as botas, e assim mesmo ainda tem gente aqui que trabalha descalço, porque não tem o material completo.
Faz 4 meses que eu trabalho nessa firma, nessa usina, e eles pegaram minha carteira profissional, não me entregaram ainda. Eu já falei com todo tipo de chefe, ele fica só me cozinhando e não me dá minha carteira de volta.
Mas sempre as horas de chegar é 3h30, tem gente que chega de 4, mas 2h30 para as 3 estamos chegando no barco.
Para eu poder ganhar uma diária por dia, eu tenho que cortar 40 braças até 32 braças quando está essa cana aqui forte desse jeito. Até 32 braças pelo salário. Se eu não cortar, eu não ganho um salário não.
Dá R$12,34.
Eles não pagam certo aqui. Paga tudo roubando a metade, né?
Não, o que a gente come é fuba mesmo, que é o comer do pobre. Né? Fuba, às vezes uma bolacha que a gente traz, né? Compra. E o feijão mesmo, quando deixa para cozinheira, tem muito que deixa. Eu mesmo
tenho 6 filhos, e o que eu ganho aqui, se eu for comer tudo aqui, eu vou para casa sem nada.
O problema é o seguinte, o problema é porque ele arruma tem a casa para morada, né? Porque hoje em dia o pobre que não tem uma casa para morar, que estiver pagando aluguel, ele é um pobre de esmola, entendeu? Ele é mesmo que viver um congelado. Porque hoje em dia quem tem uma casinha para morar, 4 tempos a vez de baixo sem pagar aluguel, ele pode dizer que é rico. E isso realmente é o que tem.
Porque a pessoa trabalhando nisso aqui não tem condição de ganhar a vida. Desse jeito, é por isso que o mundo é empestado de ladrão. É modo disso, matando a pessoa. Emprego.
Well, colonialism had very negative consequences, lasting consequences that we still see today in countries that are poor, and colonialism is one of the big reasons that poor countries are still poor. It left a legacy of violence because the most obvious example of which is the slave trade, that millions of Africans were captured, kidnapped, and taken across the ocean under horrific conditions to be slaves for the colonial powers.
I think we have to start from what the prerequisites of capitalism are. Capitalism cannot operate without free labor. Labor is a key cost of production. So, to the extent that what we're talking about here is an expansionary capitalism, it will always be looking for those circumstances
The European empires were built on riches stolen from the colonies and on cheap or free labor provided by the slaves. The gold mines of Brazil and the silver mines of Bolivia, like Pobreza, provided the European empires with the initial capital needed to start and finance their industrial revolutions. The fortunes created were so huge that the hill of Pobreza was soon represented as the Virgin Mary in religious art. The Pope himself gave Africa to the Portuguese crown and South America to the Spanish. But the Spanish Empire was so indebted because of its holy war against Islam that these riches benefited its creditors in Northern Europe instead.
La transferencia de recursos que hubo en esa época, de recursos de oro, pero fundamentalmente de plata, pero también de los llamados vegetales preciosos, sobre todo la caña de azúcar, fue una condición vital de la acumulación de riqueza que se dio en los Países Bajos, que se dio en el Reino Unido y que fue una condición de la extraordinaria riqueza que sirvió de punto de partida para el proyecto colonial inglés y para la revolución industrial, para las dos cosas simultáneamente.
La Hollande, c'était un pays d'1 million d'habitants, dans une région absolument pas favorable, avec à peu près aucune richesse naturelle. Et la thèse des néoclassiques ou des néolibéraux, c'est de dire, mais voilà, c'est bien la preuve. Un peuple élu, finalement, mené par la religion protestante, dans les conditions les plus adverses, devient un des plus riches de la planète. Et donc c'est qu'il a adopté un système économique supérieur au système des autres. Ce qu'on ne nous dit pas, c'est que les Hollandais étaient des vrais sauvages dans la manière dont ils exploitaient les colonies d'Asie et qu'ils ont pris tout ce qu'ils pouvaient en Asie et que c'est sur la base du commerce qu'ils faisaient des produits qu'ils importaient d'Asie qu'ils ont accumulé des richesses extraordinaires et qu'à un moment donné, Amsterdam est devenue la capitale financière du monde avant que ça se transfère à Londres.
In Bolivia, in the bowels of the richest mine in South America, the miners of Pobreza have built a museum to honor the memory of their ancestors and their loss.
Y una ley que pone muy malo para nosotros se llamaba la mita. La mita consistía en trabajar dentro de la mina por 6 meses sin salir al exterior. Las personas tenían que dormir, tenían que comer y trabajar dentro de la mina sin salir al exterior. Por eso muchas personas han muerto trabajando en las minas. Hay un escritor, Eduardo Galeano, que dice: con toda esta plata que se fue de Potosí, que salió de este cerro, era posible construir un puente de Potosí a España. Entonces imagínense cuánta plata ha salido de esta montaña. Y este hombre dice, se hubiera construido otro puente de Potosí a España con puros huesos de personas que han muerto en las minas. O sea, más de 8 millones, de acuerdo a la historia, más de 8 millones de personas han muerto, ¿no? Antes, como no había dinamita, no había mucha tecnología, era muy importante mano de obra. Por eso los españoles empezaron a traer esclavos negros del África para trabajar en las minas, pero también tenían problemas grandes por la altura, el frío, trabajo duro, mala alimentación. Entonces los españoles han decidido llevar a estos esclavos negros a los yungas de La Paz, donde producían hojas de coca, frutas, bananas, naranja, etc. También arroz, café. Por eso en Potosí no hay...
Les Européens auxquels se sont ajoutés assez rapidement l'Amérique du Nord, et puis plus tard, dans la deuxième moitié du 19e siècle, le Japon, qui est devenu elle-même une grande puissance coloniale, qui a fait beaucoup de mal en Asie au cours du 20e siècle, se met en place donc à partir de la fin, dans la deuxième moitié du 19e siècle, ce qu'on peut appeler la triade, à savoir Europe occidentale, Japon, Amérique du Nord, qui commence à dicter au reste de la planète les règles du jeu et impose un modèle économique qui est le capitalisme.
El primer componente es de que nos insertamos al contexto de un mercado mundial y de una expansión del capitalismo planetario como países que externalizamos el excedente económico. Es decir, hay colonialidad en tanto la riqueza que se genera por el esfuerzo humano, por la riqueza natural, no se retiene en el país, sino que se externaliza, sale para afuera. El colonialismo siempre es parte del desarrollo del capitalismo, lamentablemente.
To maintain this level of wealth extraction, the conquerors needed to keep their colonies in a state of dependency. They assigned a function to each country or region as the producer of certain minerals or a certain crop, like tea, coffee, cocoa, or sugarcane, that could be exported back to the mother country. This imposed monoculture plunged these countries into a locked economy and into a state of total dependency. The survival of their people now depended on the goodwill of the motherland, from which they had to import food. The consequences of that practice can still be seen 500 years later.
Dada ya la liberación de independencia, no hubo liberación económica, porque nosotros dejamos de ser una colonia de España para ser una colonia de los ingleses primero y después una colonia de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica. Durante todo el siglo XIX, Venezuela siguió siendo un país exportador de café y de cacao. Para finales del siglo XIX se da la segunda revolución industrial en el mundo. Y sabiendo que ya en Venezuela existía el petróleo, cuando los colonizadores llegaron y encontraron a los indígenas utilizando petróleo, solo que lo utilizaban como medicina o lo utilizaban para hacer reparaciones a los barcos. Y entonces Venezuela sí se hace más importante. Ya no va a ser un país agrícola, sino un país minero, minero petrolero.
Our government needs to stop thinking of Brazil as a colony. You know, the policies we have right now are the same as we had in the period of colonization. You know, over and over in history, what was the function in Brazil in the international economy was to produce cheap goods for the North. Before, at the beginning, was sugar. Now we are back to the sugarcane production. Then it was coffee. Then it was gold. You know, we are always producing cheap, basic materials for the North.
Significa que, em primeiro lugar, os recursos naturais do Brasil e de qualquer país do mundo, nós devemos utilizá-los para resolver o problema da alimentação do próprio povo, já que aqui no Brasil existem 50 milhões de pessoas que passam fome todos os dias. E nós continuamos a importar leite da Europa, arroz da Tailândia e outros bens de consumo da Argentina, do Uruguai e do Chile, o que é uma vergonha para o povo brasileiro.
Pare primo la canoa, que me parece que llora el pescador allá en la orilla, si le matan la semilla.
Yo soy cabeza de 8 familias, o sea, entre 8, mi esposa y 5 hijos y 3 nietos. Una niña necesita atención médica seguido, pues. Necesitaba una escuela especial y donde vivíamos se hacía demasiado imposible, pues. Porque todo el tiempo he trabajado en la agricultura y he vivido de la agricultura. Entonces conseguimos este terrenito acá y bueno, poco a poco, como hemos ido pudiendo, hicimos la casita. Hemos ido sembrando árboles frutales y todo. Tengo trabajando en la agricultura 47 años. De esos 47 años fui perseguido hasta hace 7 años. Porque éramos perseguidos por la misma gente del gobierno, que entonces mandaban la guardia, mandaban los otros cuerpos al Ministerio del Ambiente. Mira, tengo bastantes vecinos, compañeros de trabajo pues, de la agricultura, que fueron metidos como vulgares delincuentes 48 días presos por trabajar la tierra. Entonces te digo, ahí habíamos alrededor de 600 familias y quedan 6 familias. ¿Qué te digo? Ellos querían sacar todo lo que se llama agricultura para puro importar.
Lo salvará su conciencia y en eso me ha puesto el alma. Lo salvará su conciencia y en eso me ha puesto el alma.
Having obtained natural resources and free labor, the Europeans now needed to create new markets for their own productions. They separated agriculture from industry, thus preventing the farmers from making their own tools, clothes, and other utensils, and transforming them into commodity buyers. All existing industries were destroyed, and the colonies were forced to buy manufactured goods and equipment from their colonial masters.
Parce que les Hollandais ont détruit l'industrie textile d'Indonésie et ont construit une industrie textile en Hollande, aussi de céramique. Et des textiles et des céramiques qu'on vous présente comme des produits hollandais, c'est en fait des techniques qu'ils ont copiées en Indonésie, notamment à Java, les ont amenées en Hollande et ont fait la richesse de l'industrie.
Destruction des structures politiques, des structures sociales, des structures, des savoir-faire aussi. Je pense à la destruction de l'artisanat indien, la fameuse phrase de Marx parlant des plaines du Gange qui sont blanchies par les ossements des tisserands indiens.
C'est très précis, en XVIIIe siècle, l'industrie textile indienne était nettement supérieure en qualité à l'industrie textile britannique. Les Britanniques ont détruit l'industrie textile indienne et ont interdit qu'à l'intérieur de l'Empire britannique, on puisse importer des draps et d'autres produits manufacturés des colonies. Et donc on a tout produit à Londres, en copiant aussi les techniques indiennes. Et alors à partir de Londres, on a exporté du textile, des cotonnades, vers l'Inde et on les a imposées en Inde. C'est une œuvre d'exploitation, de spoliation et de destruction de ce qui existait sur place.
On a à la fois cassé les cadres sociaux et les structures, mais aussi détruit les moyens de subsistance. J'ai parlé tout à l'heure des tisserands indiens, et c'est clair qu'en Inde, quand on regarde chronologiquement l'apparition et le développement des famines, ça correspond aux destructions des structures artisanales, de la propriété paysanne, hein, des réformes foncières imposées par les Anglais.
Those challenges are still there. Some of the settlers, when they moved from this country in 1964-65 up to 1970, now they benchmarked their operations in Europe, and therefore we became the producers of raw materials, and they were now the agents for marketing and processing. Therefore, all the value addition of our crops were done away from Africa. Because like roasting of coffee, just to pick that particular crop, is done away from Kenya. In fact, you are aware that Germany, which does not have a single bush of coffee, is the largest exporter of coffee. Tea is the same. The tea that you consume in Sudan, you take it first to Europe, then Lipton brings it back to Sudan and a number of other countries in Northern Africa and a number of other countries.
One of the legacies of colonialism is that the poor countries of the third world are continuing to export raw materials, and the countries of Europe and North America produce and export finished products. This stems from a practice that was developed long ago, and the intention was to make sure that the countries of the third world remain backward and remain dependent and are never able to develop. So to this day, they are continuing to survive on the export of raw materials. That has always been to the disadvantage of the country exporting the raw materials, and it gets worse each year.
The main legacy of the colonizers was the change in mentality, religion, and culture. They came with a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other, preaching the exclusivity of salvation and imposing Christianity by force upon all, destroying every indigenous religious item they could find.
Bien, hablando de la colonia, es un poco doloroso recordar esto. Desde ese momento hemos olvidado nuestra cultura, nuestra lengua, nuestro idioma, nuestra escritura. Por entonces los aymaras somos más antes, llegaron los incas, en esa época había una cultura muy diferente y teníamos nuestra propia escritura que eran los quipus y actualmente eso se ha perdido, no lo tenemos, nos los han robado. ¿Para qué? ¿Para qué nos han robado? Para someter a su capricho, a ser sirvientes de ellos.
La conséquence la plus importante et qui remonte précisément à l'une de ces formes de la colonisation qui a été la conversion religieuse, le travail des missionnaires, etc., c'est la colonisation mentale, la colonisation de l'imaginaire, l'imposition d'une culture, un impérialisme proprement culturel avec ce que ça implique comme destruction des structures mentales, conception du temps, de l'espace, et ce qui a eu comme effet, en fait, de provoquer dans ces sociétés une perte de sens.
The conquistadors and the colonizers introduced the concept of superiority in terms of race and culture, in which the indigenous people were considered objects destined by God to slave for the white man. This created millions of marginalized people who still today have not recovered their place in society. During colonial times, no equality would be tolerated between the white man and the colored one, either in church or in state. Even today, while a Mass is celebrated in the Cathedral of Sucre, the former Bolivian capital, the old indigenous people who dare to enter will still sit on the ground. At the same time, in the next-door chapel built for the indigenous people, a local band tries to recapture their lost culture and tradition. The belief in the collective form of social organization was the indigenous people's best protection against a commodity economy, something for which they had no desire. They believed in a communal property and public utility, where the assets of the group were shared by all. This is precisely what the Europeans had to replace with the concept of individualistic interest, which drove the expansion of Europe.
Part of the purpose of Europeans in the early age of exploration was to take Christianity to people around the world. At the same time this was developing, a new form of Christianity was emerging that was very individualistic, and this was closely associated with an individualistic view of property. There had always been some element of private use, of individual families using property, but it was always tied to some communal affiliation. With the modern idea of private property, it meant that someone could use property without any obligation, any reciprocal relationship to community. You owned it, you could use it any way you wanted, and you didn't owe anyone anything. In a sense, this was a system of everyone for himself, and you could say this is the beginning of capitalism. So during this period, we have a marriage of a religious idea of individualism with the idea of individualism in owning private property.
I mean, you may not be able to abolish poverty and have usher in the golden age by just saying, eradicate private property, everything will be all right. That won't work, and we have to recognize that it won't work, and the temptation to go in that direction may have to be restrained by realism. But at the same time, it's important to understand that those who were asking for that were not asking out of a fad. They had a real issue in mind, that inequality of property and ownership is a cause of inequality of divided fortunes in our lives.
The accumulation of resources in the Northern Hemisphere created this huge imbalance, making the North extremely wealthy, allowing Europe to develop its industries and to create consumer societies, while people living in the South became destitute, only able to watch their natural economy being destroyed and replaced by a commodity economy.
Preconditions for capitalism, the labor and market and strategic resources, are all about the process of primitive accumulation. You have to dispossess in differing ways to do all of those things. You can only get someone to work in a factory if they don't have access to land. That's a dispossession. Something can only become a market if it's taken out of a non-market context. Something has to be bought and sold. It can only be a strategic resource precisely if, in fact, you exploit that resource. Primitive accumulation is not something that happens once. It happened in this way under specific circumstances in Brazil in the 16th century. But primitive accumulation is recursive. It happens time and time again under different sorts of conditions. Of course, there's an enormous amount of hype about this, but the reality is, of course, we're no less dependent on key strategic resources now than we were in 1890. And it's not just about oil, it's about a whole raft of key minerals and resources that are absolutely indispensable.
The resources of the South are fundamental to development in the North, and therefore the manner in which access and control of those resources are determined becomes crucial for the North. That is where the battle has always been. It has been there for over a century. It continues to be there. And particularly when it comes to subterranean resources. I mean, just look around you. Why did the Angolan War take that long? Or the Congo? Why aren't we interested in what's going on in Somalia? Because there is nothing to expropriate there. But there's something to expropriate in Sudan, in the Congo, in Angola, and in various places. So the resource war it will continue.
Samba triste das incertas madrugadas. Samba triste.
Que eu moro nesse barraco, falta 2.000 para pagar.
Estou aleijada da minha perna, não sou mentirosa, sou uma nega trabalhadeira, trabalhei em vários campos. E hoje em dia, olha, eu vivo assim, ó, desse jeito. Meu pai, onde você estiver, me ajude, falta 2.000 para pagar esse barco. Eu estava dormindo no meio da rua com meus filhos. Eu sou uma nega guerreira e trabalhadeira, eu não estou em condição de pagar.
Meu marido compra o leite dela, ele passa o dia todo pegando o carro no sol quente. Tem vez que ele fica sem comer lá. A gente gasta assim a faixa de R$25 por semana, que é para comprar leite, comprar fralda, comprar remédio, comprar as coisas para dentro de casa. E o leite custa R$5. O leite 5 e a massa 5.
Samba triste de São Paulo na neblina.
Muita gente que não tem um pão de cada dia em casa, não é isso? É, sou tapioqueira, me parece, mãe. Eu tô em casa, né? É? Ai, quando tá fraca, eu vendo 10, vendo 7, entendeu? Às vezes só vendo 2, às vezes não vendo nada e volto. A de coco é R$1 e a de queijo é R$1,50.
Não, a vida da gente é sempre assim, a gente não tem trabalho, ganha uma verba muito pouca e assim vai passando até o dia que Deus quiser e o povo grande, né?
Das incertas madrugadas, samba triste, ecos de passos nas calçadas, samba triste de São Paulo na neblina.
À partir de la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, on a commencé à mettre fin aux empires. Les États-Unis, d'ailleurs, qui avaient peu de colonies et qui regardaient avidement les colonies britanniques, françaises et japonaises, étaient pour l'indépendance des pays en se disant on va, après leur indépendance, les contrôler d'une autre manière. Et c'est effectivement ce qui se passe aujourd'hui. Les pays sont formellement, politiquement indépendants, ils ont leur propre gouvernement, mais ils sont dans un ensemble institutionnel qui réintroduit une forme de néocolonialisme, puisque toute une série de politiques qui sont appliquées dans les pays du Sud, endettés, sont dictées à partir de Washington, du siège de la Banque mondiale, du Fonds monétaire international, ou doivent se soumettre aux règles adoptées dans le cadre de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce basée à Genève.
Well, the sort of world order that the West and basically the United States and to some extent Western Europe have tried to maintain, it's very post-colonial in the sense of we don't try to directly politically control these countries, but we want to integrate them into an international economic order and to some extent political order. And so even the very definitions of development, the very definitions of local industry and so forth, is all geared in a very natural way to the needs of the North and extracting resources, extracting cheap labor, not creating genuine foreign competition. So if you're going to have cars produced in Africa, we'll come do it for you there and we'll use your workers and so forth. And so in that sense, it's very much a subtle form of an empire, but not an old-styled empire. It's a very subtle form, and that's, anybody with a broad historical perspective is not surprised.
When the countries of the South won their independence, the accumulated debts of the colonial powers used to open new markets were transferred to the newly formed governments in total violation of international laws. The only solution offered by the North was more debt with extremely high interest in order to repay the initial one. These newly formed states immediately lost their sovereignty and became even more dependent upon the northern countries, which could then dictate policies on agriculture, trade, and customs, and give special privileges to foreign corporations, such as monopolies over mineral extraction or monoculture exploitation.
Les États indépendants sont nés avec une dette dès le départ, qui a permis à la Banque mondiale de leur dire « Vous nous devez quelque chose, vous allez suivre nos conseils et on va vous dire comment vous développer. » Et alors là, on est dans les années 60. Et la Banque mondiale dit aux pays du Sud « Endettez-vous un maximum pour construire de grandes infrastructures de manière à exporter vers le marché mondial vos richesses naturelles. McNamara, qui est devenu président de la Banque mondiale à partir de 1968, il lance l'idée qu'il faut combattre la pauvreté, mais en même temps, il faut soutenir d'énormes projets. Le barrage d'Inga sur le Bas-Congo, des méga-projets énergétiques qui vont augmenter encore l'endettement des pays du Sud.
We will identify a country, usually a developing country, that has resources we covet, our corporations covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. Now, most everybody in our country believes that that loan is going to help poor people. It isn't. Most of the money never goes to the country. In fact, it goes to our own corporations. It goes to the Bechtels and the Halliburtons and the ones we all hear about, usually led by engineering firms, but a lot of other companies are brought in. And they make fortunes off building big infrastructure projects in that country. Power plants, industrial parks, ports, those types of things. The country's left holding this huge debt that it can't possibly repay. So at some point, we economic hitmen go back in and we say, you know, you can't pay your debts. You owe us a pound of flesh. You owe us a big favor. So sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world.
Let me give you just one statistic, which I worked out in minutes, because otherwise it's incomprehensible. Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the poorest part of the world, is paying $25,000 every minute to northern creditors. Well, you could build a lot of schools, a lot of hospitals, you could make a lot of job creation if you were using $25,000 a minute differently from debt repayment. So there's this drain, and I think people don't understand that it is actually the South that is financing the North. If you look at the flows of money from north to south and then from south to north, what you find is that the South is financing the North to the tune of about $200 billion every year.
El único que puede contratar créditos con los organismos internacionales es el Estado boliviano, es el Estado. Por consecuencia, el Estado, cuando contrata créditos bien o mal utilizados, ¿quién los paga? No es el gobierno boliviano, lo pagan los ciudadanos bolivianos con sus impuestos. En un momento dado había que cada niño que estaba naciendo ya estaba con una porción importante. Con una porción importante de la deuda. Y es más, un país que tiene una deuda, un stock de deuda de 7.000 millones de dólares y que tiene 8 millones o 9 millones de habitantes, dividamos la relación y esto casi coincide con el Producto Bruto Interno.
By analyzing poverty into those three elements, I think we can also begin to understand why poverty is so much more extreme in third world countries in the South than it is in the first world countries in the North. In the North, poverty exists largely because the resources are owned by a small elite of individuals and corporations. In the South, the same is true. The resource division is equally skewed towards a small elite. But the South also faces the continuing problem of unbalanced trade and the problem of debt. Poverty exists in every country in the world. There's no denying that. But the poverty is much more extreme in the countries that are dealing with this triple problem of trade, debt, and monopoly power over resources.
By the beginning of the 20th century, the entire Third World had been split up among the powers of the North. The two world wars forced the North to create new tools to stabilize the now global economy. The IMF and the World Bank were created with such an agenda, but rapidly they turned their focus toward the Third World, where new leaders trying to bring economic independence to their countries had emerged. The reaction was swift and used all the tools available to bring these countries back to their previous role, like the loans of the World Bank and the structural adjustment programs of the IMF. These would later lead to the crises in Latin America, Asia, and Russia, and plunge millions below the poverty line. This new U.S.-born economic model became known as neoliberalism, and the set of policies used to enforce it became the Washington Consensus, which forced all economies to let the market govern everything.
El proyecto neoliberal es un proyecto de transformación profunda de estas sociedades. El neoliberalismo en América Latina significó una recomposición de sectores productivos, significó una reducción del mercado interno, significó un proceso profundo de desindustrialización, produjo una reinserción de la economía de América Latina y una reprimarización de la producción en América Latina, donde las nuevas formas de inserción fueron nuevamente formas de inserción características de las formas del imperialismo clásico, que era fundamentalmente de materias primas.
The Washington Consensus was a set of policies that was a consensus between 15th Street in Washington and 19th. 15th Street is where U.S. Treasury is, 18th is where the World Bank, 19th is where the IMF. It was not a consensus among the developing countries. It was a consensus among a relatively small group of people who had a particular mindset, and a particular mindset during the period. You have to remember that Reagan was president of the United States, Thatcher was leader in the UK, a very conservative mindset that didn't reflect good economic policy, economic theory, as I would understand good economic theory. It had a particular political view of economics.
The Washington Consensus had four key strands. First of all, capital account liberalization. Secondly, trade liberalization. Thirdly, reduce your taxes, stimulate growth, follow the Laffer curve, a bit like following the yellow brick road. It led nowhere at all, but tax revenues went south for most developing countries, particularly in Africa. The fourth strand of the Washington Consensus was sell off your state's assets. And in most cases, they were sold off so badly, and the fees that were paid to World Bank consultants and all of the Western consultants involved were so astronomical that the end price that many developing countries got for their sales were minimal.
All of the public companies, whether they had to do with investing in agriculture or whether they were public telephone companies or public whatever, roads companies, or all of that, or nearly all, has had to be privatized. So there again, you get an opportunity for private companies to extract wealth. The World Bank used to publish, maybe it still does, but all through the 80s and the early 90s, every year it published in microscopic print long lists of companies that had been privatized in its member countries under structural adjustment programs. And every year, I counted them approximately. It was sort of 1,300 to 1,500 companies a year. They were sometimes bought by local elites. They were often, particularly the larger ones, bought by our own transnational corporations.
Bolivia became the lab rat. Bolivia was absolutely the chief test lab in South America for these policies of privatization, market fundamentalism, the things that led to the water revolt, that led to all of these issues here in Bolivia. And that's really the trajectory of how Bolivia got here historically.
En el caso de las líneas de tren, de la línea férrea, prácticamente han desaparecido. Después de que se ha privatizado, después de que se capitalizó. Hoy día no tenemos, por lo menos en el occidente no hay más trenes. Se ha desmantelado todo. Hoy día, no hace mucho, hace el mes anterior, si mal no me equivoco, teníamos unos cientos de trabajadores con 7 meses, 7 meses impago. O sea, se ha destruido el país, esa es la consecuencia de la privatización.
El gobierno boliviano, por decisión e imposición del Banco Mundial, decide privatizar el agua y para esto el gobierno toma dos medidas. Primero, la redacción de una ley de agua potable y el contrato de concesión por 40 años con la empresa transnacional Bechtel.
It was like the last thing to privatize here because the governments before already privatized everything, you know, railroads, airlines, telecommunications. So like water was the last frontier to cross.
Actualmente yo gano 35,50 centavos es nuestro jornal que ganamos. Somos jornaleros, no somos así. Nos paga por día para trabajar. Yo voy a ganar 60, o sea, voy a llegar a pagar 60 bolivianos. ¿De dónde voy a cubrir para el agua? Solamente para agua. Para comer no hay. Para vestir, para la familia no hay.
Some parts of the law said that all the water sources suddenly will not belong to the communities or to the people or neighborhoods. They will belong to the water company now. Suddenly, these things that were common, were not common anymore.
They came here and within a month of taking over, they raised people's water rates by an average of 50%, in some cases double and more. People took to the streets and said they wouldn't take it, and faced down bullets, faced down a state of martial law.
Ese llamado no solamente afectaba a las cooperativas o los pozos de agua, sino que también estaba incluyendo en las aguas de lluvia inclusive. Y entonces decidimos toda la población y salimos y llamamos a través del parlante, a través del megafón pequeñito que conseguimos también y a través con este pututo que tenemos. Y eso es lo que más alerta a la gente con putito. Les alertó, porque ellos son de la gente, mayormente son del campo, y en el campo se maneja solamente pututo, no tenemos parlante ningún índole, ¿no?
La guerra del agua viene de las áreas rurales, viene no solamente de esa agresión del capital transnacional, del Banco Mundial, de los gobiernos neoliberales hacia el patrimonio colectivo de la gente, sino ante todo esta privatización es una especie de, digamos, de aberración a nuestra concepción y particularmente la concepción que tienen las comunidades originarias, las comunidades campesinas, de que el agua es la sangre de la Pachamama.
Y así la guerra ha sido de muchos recuerdos para nosotros, porque en realidad cuando ha habido heridos, muertos, en esos momentos no están hablando, pero no, la gente estaba furiosa. Era morir o vivir. Era uno de los dos. En realidad, para mí, no se podía dejar, digamos, para nuestros hijos, hijos de mis hijos también, dejarlos así, porque todos vivimos del agua.
Now, what was particularly flawed about a lot of these theories was that they did not lead to economic growth. And that suggests both, to some extent, flawed economics, but also an important role for interest. Take the most dramatic example of this, capital market liberalization, opening up capital markets to the free flow of short-term capital. You can't build a factory on the basis of money that can come in and out of a country overnight. The IMF tried to change its charter in September of 1997 to force countries to liberalize, to open up their capital markets. At the time they did it, they had no evidence that it would promote economic growth, and there was ample evidence, both in the World Bank and elsewhere, that it led to more instability. And yet they pursued it. And my interpretation is because Wall Street wanted it.
The IMF and the World Bank, by liberalizing capital flows, opened up a wholly new criminal environment where capital could be shifted into tax havens around the world and evade tax. And this has happened on a truly astonishing scale. To give an idea of the size of this movement, the most recent estimate of the volume of capital now held offshore by rich individuals is $11.5 trillion US, and a stunningly large figure. And for those people who want to tackle poverty, this raises intriguing questions, because if we were able to tax that capital at even a very modest rate, at 30% on the income, we would be able to raise at least $255 billion a year of extra tax revenue around the world, which could be used for all sorts of brilliant purposes, but it would more than pay for the Millennium Development Goal program of tackling poverty.
La Banque mondiale et le FMI exigent une augmentation des impôts indirects, payés essentiellement par les pauvres. Exigent que les pauvres payent pour pouvoir être éduqués, pour pouvoir être soignés. Le résultat, c'est une privatisation de la santé, une privatisation de l'éducation. Le résultat, c'est que dans beaucoup de pays d'Afrique, quelqu'un arrive à l'hôpital dans des conditions dramatiques et on le met dans la salle d'attente tant que la famille n'a pas réuni l'argent pour payer la salle d'opération. Et la personne, une fois sur 3 ou une fois sur 4, décède sans avoir reçu aucun soin.
The health system, where people used to get drugs free of charge, now they have to go and pay. Even where I come from myself, I see people who are not able to go to hospital. They die of simple things like malaria because they cannot afford to pay the small fee that is required to run the hospitals. This used to be run by the government, but the World Bank insisted that the wage bill is too high and that the government has to reduce its expenditure, and reducing expenditure meant ignoring majority of the people. And that's what happened, that many people in Kenya do not have access to health facilities and do not have access to education.
We are 3 children. I'm Joseph. This is my sister, she's Helen, but she's disabled, and my other brother, he's called Josephat Odongo, and he's also disabled. So among the 3 of us, I'm the only person who at least can do something. I'm not at school because I'm supposed to pay 4,000 for the exam fees and 10,000 for the school fees, and my mom is earning 3,000, so I'm still at home. I cannot get the money. Okay, I can say life in the slum is very hard. Okay, sometimes we do go without even eating supper now. The small that we have, we do share among ourselves. Some people are eating 3 meals per day, and for you can just have 1 meal a day. And also when you go to school, you know, we have different types of people. And also there's some discrimination there because you know, you're not of the same class with the other students. I do feel discriminated because you can find like the things which they're having compared to what you have. They'll just laugh at you because you're just a slum dweller. Let's say when someone is sick, even going to the hospital, it's very hard and to buy the medicine. So maybe we'll just stay at home and take some tablets from the shop for around 10 shillings, and we cannot afford to go to the hospital.
is a great irony today that the developed countries of the world are talking about free trade as if that's the solution to the problem of poverty in the world. Much of the history of the last couple of centuries has been an effort of countries to become economically independent through tariffs, to be able to develop manufactured goods. The economies of Asia most recently developed in large part because of the ability to, or East Asia, I should say, developed in large part because they developed behind tariffs, and then once they developed to a point where they were able to enter the world economy on the same footing as everyone else, then they removed the tariffs. Now, because the United States and the European powers have prevented third world countries from doing that, and in fact are imposing tariffs to prevent the import of the finished goods from third world countries, and in fact are not practicing free trade, it's all a way of keeping the third world countries in their place and preventing them from ever developing.
In some countries, rapid liberalization of trade has meant that corn farmers have to compete with heavily subsidized corn. Their income goes down up to 50% as a result of that competition. Sugar, each of the commodities we can talk about, the liberalization of the market, opening the markets to highly subsidized agriculture, drives down the price and forces these farmers out of business, or if they stay in business, leads them to have much lower income. Another example is intellectual property. The intellectual property regime has made access to life-saving drugs much more difficult for the poor countries. It was essentially signing a death warrant on thousands of people.
These people you see over here, they are pastoralists and agriculturalists. It is livestock farming that they depend on. They cultivate maize. Now all those is gone. Now, come the year 2003, they told us that government is coming to invest here. Instead of seeing government, we saw a very unique company. This is a company from USA, Edmond, Oklahoma, USA. The company is called Dominion Group of Companies. This company is investing here, is in collaboration with Kenya government to invest here.
Wan kaka jomodak e area ni, wabedo kwang'iyo loso gik moko kaka lote makonyowa koka pesa kata gik moko kaka cham makonyowa koka yo chiemo. To kuom hau marach ni waneno mana ka Dominion beto, to Dominion guro beacons, to dakika mogik Dominion yao pigni.
Kaka an ne pio pongo ka kalure gi Dominion modonjo jaki ot makoro chuna mondo miya adar kena chaka dhi kama chielo.
Hii yote ilikuwa chakula huku, wote paka huku kulikuwa chakula. Sasa hii vyote vimeenda na maji. Tokiso pida tonyo wono biro maduong ero mogoli ero.
This company is doing aerial spraying. Now, the aeroplane makes a U-turn right across our homes. And this aerial spraying is done especially when people are working. It is done twice a week. That has affected us very much. And when you go to nearby public health centers, quite a number of children has been reported dead.
Jonge kane pi biro ne nyaka winj koyo, malaria, nobet mang'eny, suna, jamba be ne othote nikech kaka ne pi odonjo mopongo jamni e duol. Jamni go othote. Maonge kata chiel modong.
And it's quite unfortunate that what he produces there, the little that he produces there, are not sold to us. They are ferried to America. They are taken back to America. So we, the local people, the land is ours. We gain nothing from that land. It is the American government gaining, and maybe some corrupt government officials. So we are now subjected to a life of servitude in our own ancestral land. And we don't feel like moving away from that land. This is our ancestral land, and whatsoever we won't move out of this land.
Neoliberalism managed to bankrupt many of the economies of the South, which allowed international capital to take over. This was achieved by imposing a new form of structural violence that was used for decades to maintain these countries in a state of underdevelopment. Such violence was implemented by the dictators of the South and their repressive apparatus, which finally brought social unrest that was unkind to the free market economies. The special agents and economic hitmen were born and became the new, less visible means to maintain such control over the globe's resources.
If we don't like what a democratically elected leader of another country is doing, for example, opposing the exploitation of oil in his country, someone who looks like me will walk into that president's office. I had the job at one time. Walks into the office and says, and now I just want to remind you that I can make you and your family very, very rich if you play my game, our game. Or I can see to it that you're thrown out of office or assassinated if you decide to fulfill your campaign promises. And usually it's said a little more subtly than that because there may be a tape recorder listening. But they get the message because every one of those presidents knows what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala and Allende of Chile and Roldos of Ecuador and Lumumba of the Congo and Torrijos and on. The list is very long of presidents that we have had thrown out or assassinated. There's no question about that. And they all know this. So we perpetuate the system that way. Here you offer from this pocket, you offer a few $100 million, corruption. Or from this pocket, you offer subversives, jackals, to go in and overthrow the government or assassinate the president. And this has happened time and time and time again. Usually the economic hitmen are successful, so we don't need to send in the jackals. But on those occasions when we're not successful, as for me, I failed with Omar Torrijos in Panama and Jaime Roldos in Ecuador. And so the jackals were sent in and assassinated these men.
In fact, the CIA was the private army of the president, being used for highly dubious, virtually invariably disastrous interventions in other people's countries, starting with the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953 for the sake of the British Petroleum Company. We declared that the elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was a communist. The Pope would have been a better candidate. That is to say, that he was simply trying to regain some control over Iranian oil assets, and the British wanted him out and talked Eisenhower into doing the dirty work.
We did the same thing in Iraq under Qasem, who was a very popular president of Iraq and decided that he wanted to get more of the profits from Iraqi oil to go to the Iraqi people, not to the foreign companies. So we decided he had to go. He had to be assassinated. We sent an assassination team in the early 60s. It was headed by a young man at the time who failed and got wounded in the process and had to flee the country. That was Saddam Hussein. He was our hired assassin. He failed, so the CIA went in directly and had Qasem publicly executed on Iraqi television and put Saddam's family in power.
There is no question that over the years, the government has used its imperial apparatus for economic purposes, for the advantage of American firms. Perhaps The best examples are the United Fruit Company in Central America, and that is after the overthrow of the government of Guatemala in 1954 by brutal, very brutal means against a small and defenseless country. Over the years leading to civil war, police repression, at least 200,000 Guatemalan civilians have lost their lives. All of this was done because the United Fruit Company objected to some rather modest proposals for land reform. You could carry it on to the CIA's intervention against Allende in order to bring to power probably the most odious military dictator in the Cold War period, General Pinochet. Here the interests were primarily of IT&T Company. They participated closely, that is International Telephone and Telegraph, participated closely with the CIA in financing and funding and plotting the coup against Salvador Allende. Also equally in Chile, the mining interests of the big copper firms. One of the things that American imperial power has long been used in Latin America in order to protect the interest of extractive industries in very poor countries such as Bolivia, places of that sort.
On the very few instances when neither the economic hitmen nor the jackals are successful, then and only then do we send in the military. And this is what happened in Iraq. You know, the economic hitmen were unable to bring Saddam Hussein around. The jackals were unable to take him out. He had very loyal guards, and he had look-alike doubles, so it was difficult to take him out. And so we sent in the military.
Iraq represents an instance of what I've called military neoliberalism. It represents an attempt now to push forward the American neoliberal project, previously attempted to be secured through hegemonic consensual means militarily. It's as if the United States is using classic late 19th century gunboat diplomacy to break down the doors of markets, to push forward its agenda. So that's how I see it. Not that it's not about oil at all, but this isn't in any simple sense about getting that black stuff.
For decades, poverty reduction and development programs have failed to confront the different forms of power and the structural violence that hold more than 2/3 of the world in dire straits. Our chosen economic model has created a global situation in which today less than 25% of the world's population uses more than 80% of the planet's resources, while creating 70% of its pollution.
Before the big corporation amassed the huge chunk of lands that they are there, coming up with the mineral was not that hard. Mining was not that difficult. The big corporation, they were given the most productive area to mine on. So had it not been for their coming there, then people would still be mining there. And the situation, I believe, would have been different right now.
I started here in 1998. Then I got sick, my wife got sick and died. At the beginning, I had 20 people working with them here, because I have no money to nourish them, to feed them. They went to other mines.
Kwa sababu inafika mahali wanatumia ukubwa wao. Kwa sababu tunachimba chini, inatokea tunapata muingiliano kati yetu na wao. Na tukipata muingiliano, kama itatokea bahati mbaya sisi tumeingia kwao, ni mawili. Unaweza ukapigwa risasi, unaweza ukakamatwa, ukafungwa, ukapelekwa jela. Sasa yani, na wakati kama tungekuwa na mahusiano mazuri, kwa vile kule ni chini na hatuonani, tungekuwa tunakaa pamoja, tunaangalia kwamba nani kazidi huku, tunapata usuluhisho.
When the World Bank and the IMF were really putting pressures on developing nations, they were coming with conditions. You need to do this, you need to do this so that we can give you aid. You have to allow investors to come in and help you people to create jobs. That's actually not giving jobs to the locals, so that's where the problem is.
What they're trying to do is to demoralize us, as to eradicate us totally from the mining sector.
The mining fields that are holding right now belong to the locals. So once you take something from somebody, then you leave him with nothing. It means that people have been left in, people are being impoverished here severely by the coming of the big companies here. A lot of money has been siphoned out of the country as a result of this trade. So the money that would have been otherwise used for the locals here is being siphoned in some foreign countries.
What I find very disturbing in all this is that there is an implicit assumption, although it's not always mentioned, that the kind of development that is taking place is going to lead to the sacrifice of some people. So there is a very dangerous kind of an assumption, and we see it actually happening on the ground, that many people will have to suffer, many people will have to be forced into homelessness, landlessness, some will have to die, because we are following a particular economic model. And we will get to those people when we will get to them. So I think the old concepts of trickle-down theory, the old concepts of growth for the sake of growth are all very much alive. And this is very disturbing because we have evidence from around the world, whether you look at Latin America or Africa or Asia, that these policies have not worked.
How is it possible to explain the paradox of poverty? How is it that in countries in which there is growing wealth, there are actually more poor people than there were before? In short, how is it that we can explain why trickle-down economics does not work? Why doesn't wealth trickle down from the rich to the poor? There are a fixed amount of natural resources in the world, and those who own the resources, land, air, water, and so on, are able to charge higher and higher prices for them as an economy develops. In order to understand that, I think it would be useful to consider a fictitious example of what would happen if we lived in a society in which there was only one oasis that had all the water, which everyone had to come for their water supply. If a single person owned that water supply, that oasis, we would all be forced to pay as much money as we were able to for that water. Now, further imagine that if you lived in that society and you were having to pay huge amounts for some resource that could in fact be owned by all because it came from nature, and there's no particular reason for one person to own it, after a while, or perhaps even in short order, you would begin to feel intense resentment, and you would begin discussing among your fellows, what should we do about this? And you can imagine that there would in fact be an eruption of violence as people began to try to overthrow the people who owned that resource and take it.
You take away their resources so you can have it, so what do they get left? And as time goes on and that resource no longer is so valuable, gold, nobody really cares that much about gold these days, which is what the conquistadores were after. But today those same countries, a lot of them have oil. And so we took away all their gold, we destroyed their cultures, and now we're saying, and now oil's the big one, and we're going to take that too, or gas, or whatever, or water, whatever. And yeah, you perpetuate this terrible system of poverty and this system of desperation and anger.
Terrorism is directly linked to our policies with resources. In a number of these countries, the governments are authoritarian, are dictators, and they're supported by the West because we think that this is the way to protect our access to the resources. And for the population, they've associated dictator and the West
It's very interesting that if you look at the societies with the least equal distribution of income, they tend to be the most violent. There's a very small correlation between absolute poverty and crime. There's a strong correlation between unequal income distribution and crime. So you look at the poorest societies, they're not at all the ones that are the most violent. It's the ones that have the biggest discrepancy in incomes that are the most violent.
He empeorado por el sistema siguiente, que me han matado 2 hijos aquí en este barrio. Tengo uno que me lo mataron el viernes, este viernes va a ser 8 días. Estoy pasando por un dolor muy grande, empezando. Y lo siguiente, que tengo tiempo viviendo aquí, pero como yo he criado a mis hijos sola, lavando, planchando ajeno, haciendo empanadas, haciéndole para vender, haciendo todo para que mis hijos estudiaran. Y este que me mataron más porque él ya se había graduado de licenciado. Me lo mataron el viernes, este viernes que pasó. Y esa era mi esperanza y mi futuro para que me sacara de aquí, porque me iba a sacar de aquí. ¿Está entendiendo? Él no vivía conmigo porque vivía aparte. Pero el que me ayudaba todo el tiempo, no me fallaba con mi familia. Y yo, porque yo he sido todo el tiempo enferma, he sufrido de hambre, y luchando así para que mis hijos no se quedaran sin estudiar, siempre mis hijos estudiaron. Siempre mis hijos, me ha gustado que mis hijos estudien.
Poverty in the world cannot possibly be eliminated unless the poor themselves say, we insist on justice, not charity. One example of that justice is forgiving international debt. A second element would be to change the tax system in every country of the world. Right now, most taxes fall on the poor in the form of consumption taxes and taxes on wages. If justice is to be done, most of the taxes should fall on property ownership and not on wages, not on people. Third, the poor should demand agrarian reform, land reform, restoring land to the people who actually work on it instead of a few landowners. A fourth thing is to end privatization of natural resources. We've seen in Bolivia what's possible, where the Bolivian people actually took back the water that had been given to Bechtel, and they forced Bechtel out of the country, and now the Bolivian people once more own that water.
No solo lo que se narra como cuento histórico y como mirada de futuro para los países del sur es una ficción, sino que esta narrativa impide el reconocer que la apropiación de recursos por parte de quienes en el planeta utilizamos los recursos más allá de lo que nos corresponde, hace imposible que las condiciones de vida de la mayoría puedan siquiera llegar a un nivel de dignidad.
As long as you can dump it, as long as you can kill Iraqis rather than increase the price of gas, and as long as you only get Bangladeshis or poor people in New Orleans to pay the price instead of you having to drive less and take the metro or the bus or walk, our society is geared toward that choice. And the poor people and the helpless people and the unlucky to be in the places that will be in the front line will pay that price first. Famines are effective market solutions. They reduce demand. So if we leave it to the markets, that's what we have. If there's not enough food, then some people will die, and that reduces demand and the market is balanced. It's an effective market solution. So if we want to avoid such radical solutions, we need to find ways to redistribute and share what we have and get those that use a lot more start using less so that there's still enough for everybody.
The resources of nature are given to all of us, and yet a handful of people and corporations have control of them, oil companies being a prime example that everyone is familiar with. If we could enable everyone to benefit from those resources, we could end poverty. And the way to do that is by restoring the idea of the commons. It means that the value that is currently gotten from those resources, that is currently being privatized in the hands of the corporate shareholders of oil companies or mining companies or real estate syndicates and so on, instead of it being privatized, it would be made available, be shared by all. That's basically what the commons means.
Father of 5, and in fact we have poverty, but we don't know how we can come out of that.
I've got 6 children, 3 are boys and 3 are girls, so I'm working so hard so that they cannot go to bed without food.
You can even make 4,000, 3,000, 5,000 for 2 weeks. Depending on your energy.
And nowadays in Kenyans, whenever a person who working a job or blocking, he already working a small, a few months per year. Per year, he getting 3 months or 4 months, which is better.
When there is no rain, there is not enough food, so you can go to the shopkeeper, borrow there until when the rain comes. That's why we are so back that when the rain comes, you must pay that money first so that you find something to eat.
Sometimes we do get hunger. We do get hunger through that farm.
Because our stomachs are very small, because we don't have every time food, so our stomachs are very small.
It is now about 20 years where I'm suffering.
Our chosen economic system always was, and still is, financed by the poor. They did so first by giving up their land and their access to natural resources, then by financing its expansion through debt repayment, unfair trade, and unjust taxes on their labor and consumption. In addition, by forcing the poor to overpay for energy, food, and other basic necessities, the North ensures that poverty will deepen and inequalities will increase.
Il s'agit de sortir de la croissance comme du sous-développement, c'est-à-dire bien évidemment, notre décroissance, au sens où notre réduction de la pression de notre mode de vie sur les écosystèmes est la condition pour qu'eux puissent avoir un poids plus élevé. Vous pensez qu'à l'heure actuelle, si tout le monde vivait comme les Américains, il faudrait 6 planètes, mais si tout le monde vivait comme les Burkinabés, un dixième de planète suffirait. Donc, pour que les Burkinabés puissent légitimement consommer une empreinte écologique soutenable, il faudrait qu'on consomme moins, puisque d'ores et déjà, on dépasse, en moyenne mondiale, on dépasse d'environ 30% la capacité de régénération de la biosphère. Donc c'est effectivement notre décroissance est une condition nécessaire pour qu'ils puissent résoudre leurs propres problèmes, pour leur donner un peu plus d'espace de vie.
O nos emancipamos todos o nadie se emancipa. Y quienes creen que están muy bien porque tienen la comida caliente, abundante, el agua en la casa y creen que ya lograron todo, eso es falso. Eso es muy temporal, eso es muy eventual. Mientras haya gente que no tenga agua para beber, su suerte, su estabilidad es frágil. La estabilidad para que cada persona en su país o en mi país pueda garantizar verdaderamente su bienestar y si otros también tienen bienestar.
Finalement, la décroissance, c'est essentiellement une réduction de l'empreinte écologique, réduction de la toxicodépendance, donc réduction du travail, redécouverte d'autres dimensions, réduction du gâchis, réduction des déchets, etc. Si on voulait être vraiment rigoureux, il faudrait parler d'accroissance, comme on parle d'athéisme, hein, c'est-à-dire de ça qu'il s'agit, sortir de la religion, de la croissance, de l'économie, et repenser donc une organisation sociale. Alors je dis souvent aussi, la croissance, c'est pas une alternative, c'est une matrice d'alternatives. C'est sortir de ce totalitarisme économique pour réouvrir la voie à une histoire plurielle, hein, chaque groupe humain, chaque société devant définir au fond sa propre civilisation, sa propre culture, ses propres valeurs, les retrouver ou en réinventer d'autres.
I know that my daughter, who's 24, and her children are not going to have a stable, sustainable, and sane world unless every child born in Ethiopia and Indonesia and Bolivia also has that expectation. This is a very small community.